Hey fearsome friends, tonight I have some disturbing stories about some disturbed people, and they are a good reminder to always keep your wits about you and try and spot any potential grabbing hands. So sit back, relax, and remember, keep being creepy. This happened in 2012, and there are not many people I've told this story to. For my birthday that year, me and my ex-husband visited Krakow in Poland for a short break. My main interest was to visit Auschwitz and the Jewish quarter of the city, and Schindler's factory, which is now a museum. We arrived just prior to the Christmas market's opening, and I remember being disappointed that we wouldn't be able to experience them. We stayed in a very nice hotel whilst there. I won't divulge the name, but it was approximately 15 minutes walking distance from the main square and cloth market, had a beautiful balcony over the river, and was very nice with lovely, hospitable staff. I couldn't recommend this hotel highly enough. So we flew in on a cheap budget flight around mid-afternoon, showered, changed, and got ready to explore the city. The weather was cold and dreary, with some light drizzle, but more than okay to walk along the river. Krakow is an exceptionally beautiful city, and I loved it. We had a good look at the cloth market, ate a meal of matzo balls and stew in the main square under blankets and heated lights, watched the famous clock tower, and even managed to visit the lovely shopping centre with excellent shops, where I purchased a lovely cashmere coat from Zara and an equally lovely hat and scarf. Given it was our first night, we had a few drinks, which turned into a few more, where we had ended up our evening in a lovely bar beneath the city. Most bars appear to be underground in the catacombs, and I was overjoyed, since as a smoker, we are usually social lepers, but we could still smoke cigarettes in the bar. At around 1 a.m. we were tired, so decided to head home to our comfy hotel. We made our way up the stairs from the bar to the street level, and a taxi ramp was right outside. We jumped into a taxi and let the driver know our hotel location. Unfortunately though, the driver only accepted cash, so we explained we would need a cash point at some time along the 5-minute journey to the hotel. He seemed to understand and was fine with it, and at this point I need to explain that I had no mobile phone with me, as I'd left it back at our hotel. You see, in those days roaming had to be paid for, so we decided we would only take my ex-husband's phone out with us. It was 2012, so I think I only had an old iPhone 3S, and it was due for renewal. The 5-minute journey was uneventful, and we arrived opposite our hotel, which was a type of dual carriageway, and a petrol station with cash points opposite the hotel entrance. My ex-husband signalled to the driver to pull in to use the cash point, and he got out of the taxi. However, as my ex-husband was at the cash point, the nightmare began. As soon as he was dropped off, and seeing he was withdrawing money, the driver locked all the doors and sped off. I was in the back seat with several shopping bags and had no idea what was going on. The taxi driver took the main dual carriageway out of the city and kept on speeding. Initially I thought he was looking for a place to turn around to pick up my ex-husband, but this wasn't the case. The driver continued to speed until we were well out of the city limits. He spoke no English, but I asked him if he wanted money, showing him my empty bag and shopping bags, and asked him what was going on. At this point I was scared, but assumed there had been a misunderstanding. Once the driver continued past the Krakow outskirts, I was terrified, as around these parts it is rural, with no streetlights but just blackness, snow and ice. He was now shouting at me, but I couldn't understand a word. Eventually he pushed me physically and forcefully with my head into the back seat and told me, I can only assume, to shut the hell up. He then began talking on his phone to a man. The journey carried on for another 20 minutes until we came to what looked like an industrial estate. No houses and some street lights, but the whole area was just warehouses, factories and fields. He was still on his phone, sounding angry, but then abruptly turned it off and stopped the car. By this point I was petrified, and I can honestly say I have never been so scared in my life. I was praying and begging that my life wouldn't end here at 34, the mother of 5-year-old twins and ending up dead in a lockup on an industrial estate as some sort of mutilated rape victim. For about 30 seconds it was quiet, apart from my sobbing and begging. Then he got out, came around to the back car door, grabbed me and threw me onto the side of the road. He then grabbed my shopping bag, hurled it at me, then got back in the taxi and drove off. But the relief never came, as I was sure he was going to get other men to rape or harm me. I gathered myself up. It was probably -8 and snowing heavily, and I looked for some kind of doorway or hedge or any kind of shelter. I walked some meters and found a gap in a hedge where I sat down, pulled my coat and bags around me, and cried my heart out. I have no idea how long I was there, maybe an hour, maybe 2, but the sky started to lighten and a few cars and vans passed me. I tried to flag some down, but it was no good. I sat back down. I was frozen, and I can honestly say I think I was dying, and I had no more energy left. All I know from then on is the amount of thanks that is owed to some lovely Polish people. Apparently at around 5 a.m, I was sprawled across the road, hard shoulder, and a brother and sister going to market with their cattle stopped and picked me up, dragged me into their truck, and put a big cow poo-stained jacket around me. I couldn't speak apparently. I was just trying to talk to my children, and they found out my hotel location from a napkin in my bag. These wonderful people drove me 20 miles back to Krakow and to my hotel, where my ex-husband, police, hotel owner, manager, and Polish equivalent of CID were all there in the process of setting up a command center. They dropped me off still wearing the poo-stained jacket, were questioned, and went back on their way to market. I never even got their names. I was swabbed, photographed, and fingerprinted, etc., and got a stiff brandy from the bar. The following day we visited Auschwitz-Birkenau, the main reason for the Krakow trip, and that evening we were taken by the police to the taxi rank where we got the taxi from, to try and identify the driver, but of course he wasn't there. It was left with the Polish police, but dear God, I must have had someone looking after me that night. This took place around the corner from my house when I was about 7 or 10 years old. There was a food place there, and every so often I'd run over to get their milkshakes. One day my parents left to go out for the evening, and it was turning dusk. I called my mum whilst they were out to ask her if it was okay to go around the corner to grab a milkshake, and she said it was fine, as far as I can remember. Now the previous day, I had gotten a deep bruise on my arm while I was at school, and I was wearing a t-shirt as it was the start of summer. At the time I didn't know how to tie shoelaces, so I just thought I'd leave them untied as I was only just walking around the corner. Just then, a tall, tired-looking man in his 40s to late 50s came up to me and asked if I wanted him to tie my laces. I assumed he was Indian from what I could tell. He spoke with an accent, and I think maybe English wasn't his first language. I thought it strange, but I let him anyway, not knowing any better. After he was finished, he stared at me for a moment, then looked at the bruise on my arm, grabbing it and examining it. "Oh no, you need a bandage. Come with me and we will find your parents. Hearing this and becoming increasingly uncomfortable, my shy young self just mumbled, "It's fine," as he pulled out his phone and brought up a picture of his son, still grabbing onto me. I was becoming increasingly uncomfortable, especially because I was very introverted when I was young. "Look, this is my son. You can trust me," he said. At that point I knew something didn't feel right, and I really wanted to get away as soon as possible. But he was standing in the direction of my house, blocking the way, so running home wasn't an option. I was also smart enough not to show him where I lived. A few people were walking past, but not intervening. My parents never taught me about stranger danger, so all I could do was hope that someone would intervene. Just then I noticed a family walk by and go into their house from behind where the man was holding me by the arm. And what makes me so angry to this day is that nobody intervened, not even the family walking behind me. I kept saying, "It's fine, really it's fine," over and over, but no one spoke up. My heart was beating fast and I didn't know what to do. I pulled my arm away and started walking towards the food place because it was my only option. I didn't look behind me, I just kept speed walking all the way there. And when I got to the food place, which took about 5 minutes, I ordered my milkshake and waited for it to be made. I was almost in tears and barely holding it together. The man had followed me all the way there, and he was standing at the entrance, just staring at me. I really felt that I was about to be kidnapped, and my heart was racing. I was sweating and in shock, and I did my very best to hide my shaky voice when giving the cashier a thank you, and I reluctantly took my milkshake. "Hey, OP," a voice behind me said. I turned around to see my neighbour. She was a woman in her 60s and was very nice from what I'd seen of her from a few encounters. I didn't know her that well, but my parents did. She whispered to me, "Is that man following you? Do you want me to walk you home?" Looking back now, she quite possibly saved me from being kidnapped, even saved my life. The man was scared off at this point and walked away, and my neighbour walked me home and asked me a few questions about what had been going on. I answered slowly and tried to gather my thoughts and catch my breath. As we were nearly at my house, my neighbour asked if she could come in with me to tell my parents. I said no, as I was in shock and I especially didn't want my parents to find out, fearing they would get really mad at me. My parents were home at that point, and they said hello. I quietly said hello back and rushed to my room, sat on my bed, and recounted what had happened over and over. Should I tell my parents? Would the neighbour tell my parents anyway? All these thoughts raced through my mind. I hesitated for a while, then went up to my mum's room while she was watching TV. I asked if I could tell her something, and she turned the TV off. I was halfway through explaining what had happened when I broke down in tears. She got really mad, and I immediately thought it had been a bad idea, but she rushed me downstairs to where my dad and 3 of my brothers were watching a movie together. My mum explained to them what had happened, and everyone got really mad. My dad was shouting at me, frantically asking questions. After answering them, I went to my room and sobbed in my bed before falling asleep. I found out later that my parents had gone to the police station, and my 17-year-old brother went to find the man. He came back angry that he couldn't find him, and I was explained to later that my parents weren't mad at me, they were mad at my attempted kidnapper. The situation could have been handled a bit better by everyone, though, looking back, and I had to describe to my dad what he looked like, and I went to the police station to give a statement the next day, and my neighbour also made a statement. My mum had a child therapist come to the house for a day to find out if I had suffered anything that could cause trauma. Luckily I hadn't, though I was afraid to leave my house on my own for months. I will always remember that day. They never caught the guy, but I thought I saw him once bringing his son home from school. Could have been someone else, but I live in a small town. I used to tell myself that maybe he was genuinely worried that a 7 to 10-year-old was walking without parents and wasn't causing any harm. And looking back, my opinions have changed. I'd like to hear what you guys think, though. This happened when I was around 10 years old. I was at a park with 2 friends. Both of their houses were close by, and there was a sidewalk path from the park to their street. On the other side of the path, there was a cul-de-sac that ended where the park is. So the 3 of us were playing at the park when a car pulled up to the end of the cul-de-sac, probably about 20 feet away from us. There were 4 guys in the car that looked to be in their mid-20s. The guy in the front passenger seat got out, flashed a badge at us, and yelled that they were the police and to come get into their car. We had been playing spread out from each other, but as this was happening, we gravitated towards each other and quickly assessed the situation. It wasn't a police car, and they were in regular clothes. They were older than us, but didn't really look old enough to be cops. We quietly said "run" to each other, and might have even counted to 3 before we then all started sprinting down the sidewalk path to get to our friend's street. I saw the passenger get back into the car, and they started driving really fast down the cul-de-sac. We made a right onto our friend's street from the sidewalk, and they made a left from the intersecting street ahead of us, so they were driving right towards us. We managed to get to the house before them, and we all got inside and locked the door. We stared out to the window, and they had stopped right out front of the house for probably 30 seconds before they drove away. We're still not sure if this was a serious kidnapping attempt, or just a prank by some older teens, but it was definitely scary, and I was proud of how we were able to get away and watch out for each other. I've never told anyone important about this, because I'm not even sure if anyone I know would believe me. Also, it's been so long. I'm 24 years old now, and this happened when I was maybe 12 or 13. Now, when I was younger, I would always lie to my mum about where I was going for the night. Although my plans were to stay out late past curfew with my buddy Corey, I would just say that I was sleeping over at his house, and he would tell his mum the same. We've been caught a couple of times, but this incident was way before ever getting caught. My mum lives in this nice development of townhouses. She still lives there now, and sometimes walking around the development to this day brings me chills, thinking back to what I'd experienced that one night. So Corey and I were walking around the town, hitting up friends, meeting up with friends, and just doing stupid kid stuff. After everyone else had had enough sense to go home after a while, Corey and I would either go back to my mum's development and play a half-assed manhunt, or mess with any cars coming in and out of the development. In hindsight, though, I wish we hadn't done the latter. We went back to my mum's development when we noticed a black BMW driving pretty slowly into the neighborhood. We assumed it was an elderly person, but Corey told me that he thought it looked like an undercover cop. And being the idiot I was, or maybe just wanting the thrill, I believed him. We ran and hid behind the bushes and trees, and behind some rows of townhouses. We were still in play mode, but that's when we noticed something. The black BMW was definitely onto us about something, driving really slowly, and was always hanging around us. We were now certain this was some sort of cop, or someone who would get us into trouble, but we were very, very wrong. In the midst of running around and trying to hide from this car, we made a run for it across the street, when he caught us dead in our tracks. I dipped, running and yelling at Corey to hurry up, or we'd be in trouble for being caught out past curfew. But Corey just stood there. I was so confused as to why he would give up now, I hid behind a bush and watched, but kept whisper yelling for him to come join me. The black BMW turned its hazard lights on, and I noticed a figure in black get out of the car. Then a yell of a grown man's voice sounded. "Where do you think you're going?" he said. It scared the crap out of me, and I was ready for my buddy Corey to be put in the back of an undercover cop car. I was also ready for his mum to call my mum, and that'd be it for me. But as this guy walked closer, I noticed that he wasn't in uniform if he was a cop. Just casual black clothes, and not a uniform of any sort. I was confused. Then I saw this man push Corey onto the ground. That was when my adrenaline kicked in like crazy, and I ran over to try and stop what was happening. But he just pushed me to the side and left me on the ground, as he then began wailing on my friend Corey. I screamed at the top of my lungs, expecting people to come running out, but nobody came. It was then that he threw Corey into the passenger seat of the car and drove off. I was panicking. I didn't know what to do. On my way home with tears in my eyes and running to the point where it felt like I couldn't breathe, I heard the BMW racing up the street to me. He pulled up beside me and let Corey out. Corey, in tears and scared for his life, ran up next to me, and the man yelled out, "Go home and get to bed. If I see you out here again, it'll be the last." Then he angrily drove off. Corey and I aren't very close anymore, and this experience was something he never liked to talk about much. He was in the car with the guy for maybe 1 minute max, but I don't know if that guy knew Corey personally, or if he was just some asshole who'd decided he was going to mentally and physically mess with some kids late at night. We kept everything from our parents, as we only told friends at school and on the bus, but nobody ever believed us. They would just laugh and ask patronizing questions. I don't think about this incident as often as I should, maybe, but when I decide to take a stroll in the development that my mum still lives in once in a while, I'll think about that horrific moment for Corey and I. So this happened in the early 2000s in Eastern Europe. This man, let's call him Dan, was in his early 30s and was a very astute guy. Smart, good-looking, and trying to establish his real estate business. He was married but didn't have any children, and Dan's sister Mary was a friend of my mother's, and she was a few years older than Dan. They didn't live close by, but they had a strong relationship and always kept in touch. One day, late in the evening, as she was putting her children to bed, Mary got a call from the police. They told her that her brother Dan had been found dead, and they told her they'd found his lifeless body hanging from a tree. Mary and her family obviously rushed to the morgue to identify the body, and as the coroner was escorting them through, they very quickly realized that Dan's body had just disappeared. The entire family was in complete shock. They had been summoned to identify their loved one, but now his body was gone. They waited and waited. Days passed and then weeks, but they heard nothing. The police returned whatever belongings had been recovered with the body, including his wallet, watch, a pack of cigarettes and some cash and a necklace. Fast forward to one day as Mary was walking home from work. She swore she'd seen that he'd turned around, waved at her, and then just casually walked away. After some time passed, they pronounced Dan legally dead, and Mary always questioned whether it was Dan she truly saw or someone else. She believed she wanted to see Dan so much that it could have just been a daydream or false memory, but she was convinced it was Dan that she saw that day. The property Dan was looking to buy before his death was purchased by a wealthy businessman who tore down the entire residential complex and built some kind of entertainment center. There were rumors he had something to do with either Dan's death, his staged disappearance, or the snatching of the body. When I was a child, around 7 years old, my parents were very friendly with my great-uncle, who owned an auto body repair shop. He would spend the nights at the shop as a sort of family hangout, and my parents always visited the shop and took us with them even if it was dark, as me and my brother were too small to be left alone. Of course, me and my brother would goof off with our cousins and would run off to play down in the alleys by the repair shop, and me being young and innocent, I'd follow my older brother whenever he went, even though I was intensely freaked out by the dark alleys. Now, these alleys weren't regular walled-off narrow side alleys you would think of, if per se envisioning an alley in New York, but instead they were somewhat wider than a regular alley, and usually had garages lined on each side, which were always closed during the night. My brother didn't seem to be bothered by them, and neither did my cousin, so of course I just followed the big brother everywhere, and I chose to disregard my sense of fear when running up and down these alleyways. Our mother said to not leave her line of sight, though she didn't really enforce that rule, so we basically did whatever we wanted. On one particular night of doing the whole kids being kids thing and running throughout the alleys, I noticed that one of the garages was closed, yet I could see a light coming through the cracks of the door, which I found very odd. I don't think I thought much of it though, as I continued to follow my brother, running around the corner. We made a loop around a block with a lit-up garage, and once we rounded the corner again, the garage was open, and a man was standing outside of it. I'd also like to point out that a large black truck was parked parallel to the open garage a few feet away. The truck was just far enough away that we couldn't go around it from the opposite side of the open garage. We had to run through it next to the open garage side. When we were running through the alley, though, we were forced to stop by the man standing outside. The man was white, with a long beard, and that's all I can remember of him. He gave me bad vibes straight away as we lined up, suddenly stopping in our game of running, to which I was extremely confused about. He was holding out his arm against the truck so we couldn't run past him, when he asked for my cousin's name, letting him pass after my cousin answered, then putting his arm back up against the truck. He then asked for my brother's name and let him pass after our response, putting his arm up yet again and back down for me. I said my name quickly in hopes he would let me past, and thinking he would raise his arm as quickly as he did for my brother and cousin, I tried running past, but this time he held his arm out firmly and smiled at me as I ran into it. At this point I was alone as my brother and cousin had left me to continue running who knows where. I stared at the man's eyes as he asked me if I wanted to come into the garage. Now, I'd always had extreme social anxiety as a kid and as an adult, and would never want to talk to adults, let alone accompany a stranger into a random garage, so I very clearly answered, "No, thank you." He asked again, and this time 4 or so men appeared out of nowhere, I'm assuming from some back room, and flooded the lit-up garage. They all smiled at me, and I could never hide my facial expressions, so I'm sure they could tell I was stressed and wanted to leave. I said again, "No thank you," shaking my hands left and right to also gesture how I very much did not want to go into the garage. The men were all staring and attempting to look friendly as I stared at the bearded man's eyes. He just looked at me for a solid 10 seconds, which felt like forever. Even as a kid I could tell he was contemplating letting me go. He then abruptly said, "All right, thank you," and I sprinted away. As I ran, I heard one of his friends say, "Why did you let her go?" To which the bearded man just shrugged, laughed and said, "Dunno." I told my mum this probably more than a decade later, and she said my father knew the bearded man. I could only assume the man knew my father had kids, or had even seen us in passing, and had been planning this since he deliberately put a large truck in the way for us to fodder into his arm's reach, and had a group of men waiting for us. They were definitely only interested in me, though, the little girl, so only God knows what they wanted to do to me. Please, to anyone who wishes to have kids or already has children, do not, under any circumstances, leave your children alone. My mother, on any other occasion, I believe, was extremely protective, but on the small times I would stray from her, predators were ready to try and snatch me. They watch, they know, and they will try to take your kid, even if you are standing 10 feet away from them. So when I was around 7 or 8, my parents took me to a Christmas market that had tons of activities for kids. Now I didn't know this at the time, but my parents were fighting, and thus preoccupied, so had mostly left me on my own. The way the kids' area worked was that you bought vouchers at the door that would then allow you access to use one voucher for one activity, like baking cookies, painting, and wood burning for older kids, etc. It was pretty fantastic, and some of the stuff had queues if there was a lot of interest. Now I'd gotten about 10 vouchers. An activity was about 15 minutes, and my parents were in a cafe in the building, but well out of sight. Since it was an area you could only get into if you accompanied a kid, or were a kid, I guess they felt safe leaving me alone. And this was allowed, but not encouraged. Anyway, I was queuing for my favourite activity there, the fabric painting section, where you'd have a piece of linen that you could draw Christmas patterns on. It was already my 3rd time, and I had to queue, and when I was about halfway to the entrance, someone grabbed my arm. I panicked immediately because my parents would never have touched me like that, and I didn't know anybody else there. I yelped and tried to pull away, but couldn't, and turning around I came face to face with an older lady, maybe in her 40s or 50s, and she was well dressed, looked pretty strict, but otherwise normal. She was pulling me out of the queue against my will, and I tried to yell out and asked her to let me go, but she just said something like, "You always do this, come on Marie." Now my name is not Marie, not even close, and I yelled as much too, still thinking that she had just confused me for someone else. I was a pretty average-looking girl with a brunette ponytail, nothing particularly special, and nor were my clothes. She looked down at me again and scoffed, telling me to stop throwing a tantrum and that we were going home. It was at that exact moment that I realized that if I didn't escape right now, she was going to take me away. So I basically opened my mouth and screamed at the top of my lungs. Not words, just a screech. Before that I'd mostly asked loudly to be released, but not full-on screaming. I was a polite kid, and she then paused mid-step because clearly I'd startled her, but she didn't let go yet. I screamed about the only thing I could really make sense of, shouting that my name is Sam. This was the first time that people actually looked at us as more than a mom or grandma and a kid in a tantrum, because I was clearly too old to not know my name, and also visibly scared. I was still trying to pull away, but she had a grip on my forearm like a vice. I made eye contact with the first random person I saw looking over, and it was a guy in his early 30s, I guess, definitely younger than her, and I just pled for him to help me. He thankfully actually came over at that point, and we were now in sight of the exit as she dragged me quite far, but I guess at that point she decided that it was too much of a hassle and let me go. Since I'd been fighting her, I immediately slammed into the ground, which actually prompted more people to step up to help me. I was sobbing, and as soon as I could get to my feet, I ran the other way to my parents. I must have barreled into 10+ people and kids on the way to where I knew my parents were. It was a cafe, like I'd said, and they were in the middle. Now my mum had super recognizable fake red hair, so even sobbing I could see her easily. I banged into a table, knocked stuff off, and then just threw myself at my mother. I was in no state to explain, and she was both mad at me for making a scene and really worried, because I was not the type of person to cause a disturbance like this ever. I wanted to explain but couldn't. There was a bit of commotion around, with people being nosy, but as I calmed down I realized that the guy I had begged for help was explaining to my parents what had happened. I hadn't even noticed him come with me, but I kind of tuned in when he kept asking if my grandma was here or something, bearing in mind she's not even in the same country, and if I could have known who this woman was, etc. Obviously my mother confirmed that that was not the case, and asked if what he'd told her was right. He confirmed that some woman was dragging me off, calling me Marie. My parents, the guy, his son who was a fair few years older than me, maybe 15 or so, went with me to security, where I tried and failed to describe the lady. The guy had a much better description of her, but she was obviously long gone. I think they called the police, but I never spoke to any cops that I can remember. I felt really awkward and sorry that I'd ruined the other kid's day there, so I gave him the rest of my vouchers so he could do more stuff if he wanted. He was really nice and gave me a pack of the cookies he'd baked to eat while the adults were talking. I don't remember any of their names or anything, but I remember how grateful I was to the kid, more so than his dad even. It was just really comforting to me that I had another kid around who was nice. Anyway, my parents took me home, as soon as possible of course, and we never went to that place again. There was a short story in the newspaper the next day about a kidnapping scare that my mother told me about some years later, but it was all just speculation, and they didn't even confirm in the paper if it was an attempt or just a misunderstanding. Well, it sure as hell wasn't a misunderstanding. They never caught the lady, or did any follow-ups as far as I'm aware. I actually had bruises on my arm where she'd gripped me through my sweater. I still don't like Christmas markets much. Several years ago, when I was 25, I lived with, at the time, one of my best friends. Our friendship eventually started to dwindle, as it usually goes when you move in with a good friend, so she was rarely home. This night, however, she ended up staying at our place, heading to bed early. I was a server at the time, so I stayed up pretty late, usually watching YouTube and smoking pot. This night was no different than any other, except for the fact my neighbours tried to kidnap me. I'll go ahead and give you some background info on my house and my neighbours. We lived in a 3-bedroom house with 2 bedrooms and the kitchen facing the crazy neighbours. They were a younger couple, living in a smaller mill house, and they were constantly coming to our door asking for handouts. Now normally I'd be happy to help a neighbour out, but they would come over and ask for crazy stuff like for us to fill up an old Mountain Dew bottle with water because theirs got shut off, beer, and once literally to ask for $1. They would consistently be knocking at our door to ask for help, and when we wouldn't answer, I'd peek through the window to see them either jacking cigarette butts from the ashtray or pressing their eyeballs against the door peephole to see if they could spot us. Anyway, there I was smoking some weed and watching YouTube on my couch when I heard a knock at the door. It's 11 p.m, and I checked the peephole, and sure enough, the boyfriend was on my porch. Normally I'd just walk away and continue with my life, but he looked like he was in distress. I opened the door up to see what was up, and he just wanted to come over to see if I would film his engagement. He's got his girlfriend a ring in his pocket, and he needs me to follow him to his backyard and film it for him. Baffled but curious, I told him congratulations and said that I'd be out in a second. I just needed to put some shoes on. I shut the door behind me and locked it, quickly ran back to the room that looked out into their backyard, and I peeked through the blinds to see the setup. Nothing. Pitch black darkness. No sign of decorations or anything like that. Naturally, I woke up my roommate and told her what was going on. Yeah, forget that," she said to me, and we both walked back up to the door after he started banging on the door again. I looked through the peephole. I couldn't see anything and was confused all the way up until he pulled his eyeball away from the peephole. I quickly turned around and put my back up against the door. My roommate came running back to the door from her room, holding 2 wire hangers for protection. We both clung onto the hangers and sat up against the door until he finally left. We were so freaked out, but we wanted to make sure we weren't overreacting. So we went out our back door and hopped into her car so we could do a drive-by, as they always had their front door open and also didn't have any blinds, so it was easy to see into their house. Slowly we crept by in her car and peered into their living room. Sitting on the couch and all staring at the wall, they looked strung out, was the couple and an older man. We sped off and ended up staying at a friend's house that night, and I never answered the door for either of them again. One day I came home from work, and an older lady was parked in their driveway. She walked up to me as I got out of my car and asked if I knew where the neighbors were. I told her I hadn't seen them for a while, and she informed me that she was the owner. She told me they were months late on rent and finally came to evict them. She entered the home to find it completely trashed, needles and garbage everywhere, holes in the wall, and literal feces on the floor. I told her I was sorry to hear that she had to deal with all of that, but I was happy that they were finally gone. I'm not 100% sure what was going on that night, but I'm glad I didn't follow him to the backyard. Growing up in Malvern, Pennsylvania, I used to attend KDM Elementary School from the 1st to the 5th grade. At every student's 5th grade year, the school always holds a play for the entire 5th grade class, which unfortunately you have to participate in. And if memory serves me well, we were split up by our different main classrooms. I'm 26 now, so it's been a while. Anyway, we had to make our own costumes, and lucky me, I got to make a ladybug costume. Well, when we had to rehearse for our final play, and all get into our groups at recess for it, this was when I believe that I almost got me and my friend abducted by a paedophile. Now my best friend Kevin and I would hang out at the edge of the schoolyard tree line where there were some pine trees that separated our school from someone who lived right next to it, and we were trying to avoid the whole play thing because we thought it was all really stupid, to be honest. Now the way our teacher supervised us was to kind of let us do our own thing, practice our buzzing and running in circles and whatnot. And when it was time to go in, the teachers would all blow their whistles to signal it was time. So there we were, chilling at the wood line, hiding out, when we suddenly heard this voice calling us, saying, Hey you kid, want to see something cool?" Now I guess I didn't have any fear of such situations like that, or not enough sense to notice something was wrong, and my friend even said, "I don't like this, maybe we should go back." But I called him stupid and said that we should go see what he had to show us. After all, he said it was something cool, right? What little stupid curious kid doesn't want to see something mysteriously cool? The guy was old, probably 70 to 75, and was wearing one of those short-sleeve plaid collared shirts. Also, I think he was wearing jeans, but it's been so long since it happened that all I remember was that his shirt was tucked in. So we followed this guy, and Kevin kind of slowly followed me, as I follow him past the pines and onto what we thought was his property. I can tell Kevin is scared, because he keeps looking around, and was saying that we should head back. but I really wanted to see what this guy had to show me, so I just ignored him and kept following the old man. He led us to a shed behind his house, and I kid you not, it was one of those small red ones with the white trim, like the old-school American farm-style barns. He then opened the door and said, Go in and look." So we went in, and this guy had a complete antique doll collection. Me and my friend were standing in the middle of this shed doing a full circle viewing them, and I mean they were everywhere. It was then that this really uneasy feeling crept over me as the guy was standing in front of the doorway and said, "Didn't I tell you it was cool? I've been collecting them my whole life. What do you think?" I figured I shouldn't be rude, so I told him it was cool and that I'd never seen dolls like this before. But I did that way a kid tells his grandmother he really loves the sweater she made him for the 5th year in a row, trying to be sincere, but failing. Just then we heard the whistle, and Kevin gave me a weird look. By the way, at this point my fear was going through the roof, like I knew something bad was going to happen. For some reason I can't explain it, but what I needed to say eventually came to me, so I started walking to the door to leave, as I told him, "This was really cool, thanks for showing us. That's our whistle, so we have to get back to our head count." He nodded his head and said, "If you ever want to come back and play with them, you're always welcome," then moved aside so we could leave. I never saw him again after that, and I'd honestly forgotten about it until a couple of years later, when I told my dad the story. We were talking about how much money antique dolls were worth, when he freaked out at me when I told him about the guy's collection. That's when I realized how close I could have come to something terrible happening to me and my friend, and all because of my childhood curiosity. He told the school about it, but the guy's not on any registry, and I don't think he's ever done anything wrong. Well, at least as far as anyone knows. Still, it was really weird. Who would think 2 5th-grade boys are going to find dolls interesting? I feel we only got away because I'd mentioned the head count the teachers do, so he thought he wouldn't be able to shut the door on us without them finding out. This happened about 3 years ago, around mid-June at 9:50 p.m. Twilight was fading into night, and it was hot as hell. So I decided to take my then 2-year-old son out on a short walk around the block to cool off. We were only half a block away from our house when a 1980s Oldsmobile slowly crept up from behind us, then slowed down to match our pace. My 2-year-old was in a stroller. I stopped and the car stopped too. I could see that there were 4 large men inside, all wearing the same black hoodies and black pants. 2 of the men exited the car at the same time. One went to the house in front of me and stopped at the door, and the other man went to the house behind me and stopped at that house's door, like they were going to knock, and the car with the 2 remaining men inside were to my left, essentially surrounding us. I noticed that neither of the men were knocking on the doors that they were standing in front of, and they were both just staring at me. I was freaked out, so I decided to walk as confidently as possible past the man in front of me and quickly turned the corner that was the closest way to get home. I had that feeling of dread in the pit of my stomach, so I decided to walk into a neighbor's darkened yard and hide. And as I did, I saw the car with all 4 men inside driving down the road very slowly. I waited, and about 3 minutes later they drove past again very slowly. I decided to run after they'd turned down the street again, and I told myself that I had 3 minutes to get home, so I ran as fast as I could and hid in another neighbor's yard when I once again saw the car drive past slowly. But now with someone in the passenger seat, using a flashlight, seemingly searching for us. Once they'd driven past again, I ran as fast as I could, pushing the stroller as fast as I could, making it into my garage just in time to see the car driving past with a flashlight again. I put my son inside and watched as they drove past 2 more times. I now don't walk at night if I can avoid it, and never with my son. I also carry a .38 caliber revolver and sharp knives if I do, and I sincerely believe that they were trying to snatch us, but luckily we got away because I listened to my gut. Please be safe and always trust your intuition. Looking back on it, I realize now what a corny and oddly specific way it was to greet 2 kids you're trying to kidnap. But damn did it almost work. I was probably 8 years old at the time, and every week I watched WWF wrestling on the TV with my dad. Yeah, I do, I answered, as the 30-something man I had never seen before continued to approach my friend and I. We were at a local elementary school for a Little League baseball game, and while my friend's brother played baseball, we played on the playground and ran around the asphalt blacktop. The closest adults to us were probably 500 yards away, and this guy didn't have any kids with him as you'd expect, being a grown man in a child's play area. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but it really sticks out now. "Who's your favourite wrestler?" he asked, standing just feet from us, his hands shoved in his pockets unassumingly. "I like the Big Show and Stone Cold Steve Austin," I replied. I had always been a sociable kid, and I still am sociable all these years later, but I had never met a stranger, as the saying goes, as ironic as it is in this context. My friend, who was much more shy, stood there silently. "I like him too," replied the stranger. "Hey, I have a bunch of wrestling videos at my house. Do you want to come watch them?" "I don't know about that," I replied. Not because I had a bad feeling about the situation, but because my mum has always made me promise her never to go anywhere with a stranger. "Oh, come on, it'll be fun. Plus I have a dog who loves kids. Let's go. I'll take you in my truck." For some reason I felt the need to know this guy's name. Not that it would have made a difference had he chosen to snatch us then and there. And it was before cell phones were really popular, and we definitely didn't have one of those. "What's your name?" I asked. He laughed, more huffed, before telling me his name was Junior. "Junior what?" I asked. All of a sudden a worried look came over his face, like me asking for his real name was all it took to shake him from his plan. "Hey, never mind. You'll have a good day," he said as he began to hurry away. We turned around and made our way back to the baseball game, and we never told my friend's mum. We never talked about it at all, really, and it wasn't until a few years ago that the memory randomly popped into my head, and I realized that guy was trying to kidnap us the whole time. I'll never know what foiled his plan, but I'm glad things went down the way they did. Now I often go out in the wee hours of the morning, around midnight to 4 a.m, just to take a walk, or sometimes with particular incentive. And this one particular night, I decided to call my friend whilst I walked. I stopped in at a nearby gas station to buy some water because I was getting thirsty and I had forgotten to bring any with me. When I went in, I hung up on my friend for a minute because I knew he would intentionally do something weird while I was in there, and I didn't want him making it harder for me to pay through my anxiety. However, as I was walking out, I noticed there was a guy in a black pickup truck waiting outside. I still had my earbuds in, but I hadn't called my friend back yet, when I heard the guy ecstatically say, "You need a ride?" I whipped my head around to look at him, because it startled me that someone was talking to me. I quickly said no and started walking away casually. He almost looked scared when I responded to him. At the time it didn't really set in what had happened, but I later realized he was probably testing to see if I could hear him. If I couldn't, I don't know what he would have done. I then called my friend back and told him what happened, and he just laughed it off, but told me I should get home as fast as I could regardless. After that, I crossed the overpass to another store to see if it was open, and a guy in a sedan started following me slowly. Maybe I was a little more paranoid from the previous encounter, but it looked like he was staring directly at me. I told my friend about this too, and started walking a little quicker. The car didn't end up following me out of the parking lot, and I went on back home about an hour later with no further trouble. I guess I'm just lucky I've never been sought after before. So this happened about 8 years ago when I was 17. We're from the Bronx, and everyone knew who we were on my block. I was the one raising my brothers, so I would always take them everywhere I went, and we would spend summer days at the zoo or different parks around New York City. Now one particular summer day, I had taken them to a park not far from home and was headed back right before sunset. As we crossed the street and approached a somewhat isolated area, I noticed a black van up ahead. Being from New York City, you learn not to react to strange things, but I was still keeping an eye on it because it was parked on a fire hydrant and didn't have a license plate. I had my then 2-year-old brother hitched onto the right side of my hip and told my then 7-year-old brother to get on the right side of me, putting him between myself and the building, and kept walking as fast as we could without raising suspicion. As we were about 5 feet from the van, a man stepped out from the driver's side and was headed towards the back of the van. Then another man opened the passenger door, but didn't come out. At this point, the man was approaching us and making an uncomfortable amount of eye contact with me. Something in me then just decided to point to the window of a house behind him and say really loudly, as if I was speaking to my brothers, "Look, it's not even curfew yet, and Mum is already looking out the window for us." The man stopped right in his tracks and looked to where I'd pointed, then looked at us one more time before running back to the van. They started it up, but didn't move, so I grabbed my brother's hand and crossed the street, knocking on the door of my supposed home, and prayed that someone would answer. I knocked again, and after about 15 seconds of sweating bullets, a woman answered the door, and I explained to her in a quick whisper that I believed that the men in the van behind us were trying to abduct us, and we needed her to pretend to be our mum. She paused for a second, and then smiled and let us in, and then locked the door behind us. She asked if we were okay, and if we needed her to call the police, and I said that if they weren't gone in 10 minutes, then yes. When she looked outside about 7 minutes later, the van was thankfully gone. After that, I had called the son of a shop owner near my building and asked him to meet us and walk us home, which he obliged. Thank goodness that woman was home. She told me that she had left work early that day because of a bad migraine. My mother had left a bad marriage, and our lives were at most times decent, and it took her quite a long time to meet a new man. Now this new man was in his 30s, with grey blonde short hair and an immense muscular body. Tall as a tower with small black piercing eyes, he had a very charismatic personality that could win over even the most cold-hearted of people. He seemed to like my mum, and she seemed happy with him, so I had no right to complain, because even little kid me liked him. But it started to become strange when my mother decided to uproot our life to move to this guy's small house in a small village a few miles away. And after 2 years of living there was when the odd things started to happen. Now my mum was going to have a party for her birthday and invite some friends plus my brothers. It was nothing remarkable, good food and people making small talk. But my mum getting so much attention clearly made him annoyed. I don't remember exactly what my mum said, and even if she'd said anything at all, but we all of a sudden heard a sickening crunch, and I saw my mum in a puddle of blood. As she was still talking, she began to gurgle and said, "I am so sorry," over and over again. What happened? Well, he had hit her with a stone ashtray right over her face, knocking out teeth and breaking her jaw. His eyes looked so crazy, so dark and empty. I remember tossing myself onto my mum and begging him to leave her alone. He grabbed me and tossed me into my room and locked the door. Then fighting ensued, and he ended up leaving the house, driving away in his car. But my mum, even after this event, refused to leave him. It was her fault, she said. Many horrible things happened during the last years we lived there, but I guess the last straw came from when he almost killed my dog for liking me more than him. My mum somehow woke up from a dark sleep that had trapped her for the past few years and ran with me to a bus stop during the night when the monster slept. We had only a suitcase with a few things, as I'd left everything else behind, but we would later get it back in small pieces in a plastic bag. He would call us over and over again, trying to find us, but we'd thankfully found a safe place. Then suddenly he stopped calling. We never knew why. Fast forward 3 years, and we were back in our old hometown. I was walking home from school one afternoon, listening to my Walkman and watching the trees in bloom, when out of nowhere, a car stopped in front of me, and a hand reached out and yanked me into the car. It was him, smiling widely and saying nothing. He locked the car and I felt my eyes starting to well up with tears. "Do not cry, okay?" he said while raising the volume of his music and driving quickly out of town, down dirt roads with trees speeding by like green and grey blurs. I awoke from my fear and saw that house again. He stopped the car, dragged me up the stairs, and me knowing that this might be the last day alive, I begged, but he did nothing to listen. I heard the music on his CD player and almost shouted, "I've never heard this song before. It's great." He stopped, looked at me and smiled. It was a real smile, but with no emotion in his eyes. "Right? They're Italian and one of the best bands I've heard." My mouth could not stop talking. I would praise his looks and his music, doing anything to befriend him, to survive, it felt like. It took almost an hour before my cell phone started ringing, and him, looking irritated, answered it for me. "Hello, Opie's brother, how are you?" I heard angry mumbling from my phone and him nodding. This went on for an hour before he started to get his shovel and placed it in the hallway. My mum then called, and he quickly answered and smiled. I don't know what she'd said, but it worked. He somehow decided to take me back to the outskirts of our town. I was shaking and walking like I was in a slumber all the way home. My mum was angry. She never believed that I didn't go on my own free will. The dreams of this event wouldn't go away, and we were lucky. Sadly, some animals and people were not, though. But thankfully, he now sits in prison. But I still wonder what his reason for taking me that day was. Hey there, it's me again, Miss Fearsome. I hope you enjoyed my video. If you did, then please hit that subscribe button. And if you'd like to support me further, please check out my Patreon and sign up for as little as $1 a month. Also, check out my new YouTube membership levels for some exclusive perks. So until next time, stay happy, stay safe, and remember, keep being creepy.